Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tackling a massive, complex, and honestly, a fascinating global mystery. It's a question that gets right at the very heart of international law and human dignity. What if the value of human rights actually depended entirely on where you lived, who you were, or which country was involved? Every single year, governments and international organizations take to the podium to speak passionately about freedom, justice, and equality. But if you look closely at the global stage, critics often argue that responses to alleged human rights violations vary wildly depending on geopolitical interests. So, is there a real double standard here? Or is the picture way more complicated than it appears on the surface? Let's map out the facts and examine the mechanics of this global debate together. Okay, let's dive into this. Does the value of human rights depend on geography? It's a highly provocative question, and honestly, it's meant to be. We're going to explore this dialectically today, looking at the different forces that shape international responses. We'll look at the ideals we hold, the messy realities of geopolitics, and the institutions caught right in the middle. By breaking all this down, we can start to see exactly why the global response to crises can sometimes feel so incredibly inconsistent. First up, let's look at the human rights ideal. Before we get into the friction of it all, we absolutely need to understand the baseline foundation. Human rights are defined as universal rights that belong to absolutely every person. They're fundamentally inherent to the human condition. Universal rights belong to everyone, regardless of nationality, religion, ethnicity, or political beliefs. This means there are literally zero exceptions. The core philosophy here is that these rights aren't something you earn, and they definitely cannot be revoked based on your passport, who you worship, or how you vote. Think about how fundamental these concepts are to your own day-to-day life. We're talking about the right to life, freedom from torture, freedom of expression and religion, access to food, healthcare, and education. The principle is incredibly simple yet powerful. Every single human life holds equal value. That's the baseline ideal the international community has agreed upon as a global standard. But applying this beautiful ideal in a messy world is exactly where the debate begins. Which brings us to the double standard debate. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast it highlights. Many observers around the world argue that similar situations on the ground receive drastically different international responses. On one side, you have governments facing severe consequences for alleged human rights violations. We're talking strict economic sanctions, sweeping international investigations, and total diplomatic isolation. But on the flip side, governments facing very similar criticisms over human rights concerns sometimes receive continued military, economic, or political support. This juxtaposition, harsh isolation versus continued backing, is exactly what fuels the perception of a glaring double standard. So, how do we make sense of this divide? Let's impartially lay out the two main perspectives. Critics argue that these inconsistent responses are essentially proof that the system reflects political alliances, strategic interests, and economic relationships, rather than a consistent application of principles. Supporters of these differing approaches, however, push right back. They argue against a one-size-fits-all model, noting that every single conflict has highly unique historical, legal, and security contexts that diplomats and leaders have to navigate extremely delicately. Next, let's explore the role of international institutions. If human rights are universal, who is actually in charge of protecting them? Well, it's basically a three-step process. Step one, organizations like the United Nations, international courts, and human rights groups do the groundwork. They investigate alleged abuses and publish detailed reports. But the whole process hits a massive bottleneck at step two. These organizations don't have their own global police force. Enforcement relies heavily on state cooperation. And that brings us to step three. Powerful nations shape the outcomes. For instance, veto powers held by the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council can single-handedly halt enforcement actions. This structural reality is exactly what leads to widespread perceptions that global accountability is deeply uneven. Let's shift gears and look at media and public perception. Think about the headlines you scrolled past this morning. Why do some crises completely dominate the global news for weeks or even months on end, while other crises, often with equally severe humanitarian consequences, are virtually ignored? It's a fascinating reality. The severity of a crisis doesn't always match its visibility. The answer frequently lies in the practical realities of the modern newsroom. Media organizations make editorial decisions based on several deeply practical factors. Do journalists have physical access to the region? Is there existing audience interest driving engagement? Is it safe for reporters to be on the ground? What are the competing news priorities that day? While these are perfectly understandable logistical constraints, critics strongly argue that these choices deeply influence public understanding.
If a conflict isn't covered, the global public doesn't demand accountability, and that can further fuel the perception of a double standard in how the world responds to suffering.
Moving right along to the Geopolitical Balancing Act. And this brilliantly illustrates what happens behind closed doors. International relations are heavily shaped by strategic alliances, national security needs, trade routes, energy interests, and regional stability. These aren't just abstract concepts. They are the fundamental survival mechanisms of nations. Because of these intense pressures, governments are constantly forced into a high-stakes balancing act. They have to weigh human rights concerns against their broader foreign policy objectives. This persistent reality, balancing ideals with national interests, is the primary engine driving the ongoing debate about consistency in international responses. Finally, let's look at the ultimate dilemma. Can human rights be truly universal? The central question really boils down to this: should standards apply equally to allies and rivals alike? Legal scholars and human rights advocates demand consistent standards. They argue that the entire credibility of the human rights framework depends on applying the exact same rules to everyone, completely regardless of the political fallout. Diplomats, on the other hand, emphasize a very different reality. They argue that diplomacy isn't a courtroom. It often requires carefully balancing those pure legal principles with harsh practical realities in order to avoid much greater global conflict. So, where does that actually leave us? As we wrap up this explainer, there's a core takeaway to focus on. Whether you personally believe there's a rampant global double standard, or you believe the sheer complexities of diplomacy justify different approaches, one principle remains widely accepted across the board. Human rights are intended to protect every person equally. That is the goal. The massive, enduring challenge of our time is figuring out how to ensure those principles are applied consistently, transparently, and fairly across all situations, despite the ever-present pressures of power and geopolitics. If you found this structured dive into the source material helpful, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more visual explainers on global affairs. We'd absolutely love to read your insights, so let us know in the comments below. Should international human rights standards be enforced equally for every single country, completely regardless of their power or their alliances? Let's keep the conversation going.